Hello, friends. How are you tonight? Hi, Dolores. Hi, Steve. Hey, Mark Collins. Hi, Kay. And hi, Elaine McForbes. I guess you're here because you've shared the video. Thank you. Oh, and Zohar must be here because she has shared. Jeff Epstein looks like he's here. Thank you all for sharing. Okay, so this is going to be an evaluation of the Trump administration's response to the pandemic, and it's going to be in a comparative context. So let's get started by considering a post which appeared in Daily Kos. I don't usually pick up things from Daily Kos, but I thought this piece was kind of interesting. And the name of the piece is Sweden Never Shut Down. Now its death rate and its economy are worse than its neighbors. And this had the name Kos on it. Of course, the owner of Daily Kos, and was attributed to the Daily Kos staff. I don't know if Kos actually wrote it or not, or whether a team of people wrote it, but anyway, here it is. And that's a picture of Anders Tegnell, who is said to be the architect of Sweden's Keep Everything Open approach to the coronavirus. And it's also said that he's having second thoughts. So, according to the article, what we're learning now is that failing to shut down in Sweden hasn't just led to more deaths, but surprise, 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 it also hasn't actually prevented the economy in Sweden from tanking. In fact, Sweden is poised for more economic pain than its neighbors. And this is a really short post, but it has some data in it, and that's the world ranking of deaths per million residents, excluding very small nations, the micronations, so called. So surprisingly, the highest deaths per million has occurred in Belgium. Okay, and Belgium has a universal health care system, but I guess it did not act extremely vigorously to shut things down when the virus first came in, and so it has the highest deaths per million. Now, second is Spain at 558 million, 558 per million, I should say. Italy is third with 495 per million. This is fatalities per million. And the United Kingdom is 451 fatalities per million. France is at 395 fatalities per million. The Netherlands is 309 fatalities per million. Sweden is at 301 fatalities per million. Ireland is 284 fatalities per million. And the U.S. stands at 230 fatalities per million. Now, the article says Sweden, like the United States, has been quickly moving up this horrid chart and will overtake the Netherlands sometime this weekend for the sixth spot in the world. Meanwhile, its neighbors, following more standard shutdown protocols, are looking pretty okay. And here's the deaths per million in the immediate neighbors, okay, of Sweden compared to Sweden. Sweden's at 301 fatalities per million. Denmark has only 89 fatalities per million. Per million, sorry. Finland has 46 per million. And Norway only 40 per million. Now, Norway has 207 fatalities, all told, with a population of roughly 5.5 million, if I recall correctly. Now, Fairfax County, Virginia, here in the United States, one county over from where I live, okay, in Ashburn, has had 227 fatalities as of this morning, as of last night, I should say. And the population of Fairfax County is 1.15 million as of 2018. It's probably pretty close to the same now. So Norway has 5 times the population of Fairfax County and 20 less fatalities than Fairfax County. And of course, if we look at the comparison of Norway with the United States, so the United States is it must be 60 times the size of population, okay, of Norway. Okay, but on a per million basis, it has 230 fatalities per million. Norway has only 40 fatalities per million. So from the fatalities standpoint, it seems to me Norway is doing 6 times better than the United States. I think that's fair. As of now, I think the United States is doing better than Sweden, but of course things in the United States are beginning once again to accelerate because we are opening up the economy here when we have not really flattened the curve in the whole United States yet. Okay, now the United States is an odd situation if you look across countries. The rest of the countries we've been looking at here today are all a good deal smaller than the United States in area. and they're not split into as many regions as the United States, though there are distinct regions, okay, in Italy, distinct regions in Spain, okay, and in the UK, and in France. The number, okay, of regions and the relative isolation of the population in these regions is different in the United States. It takes a while for things to spread all through the South and all through the Midwest. Okay, the density of population is probably higher on the West Coast and on the East Coast, okay, especially in the Northeast, okay, and in Florida, okay, as well. And we see hotspots there. We see hotspots there. And in New York State, we're beginning to see a bending of the curve. But there are many others, areas in the United States where contraction of the disease is beginning to accelerate, and the number of fatalities is beginning to accelerate. And we see the economy, on the orders of the administration or with the encouragement of the administration anyway, is starting to open up in many of the states without reference to where the states are in the process of flattening out the curve of case occurrences and fatalities due to the coronavirus. So there's every expectation right now, as we'll see, okay, in just a minute, that the death toll is going to accelerate here in the United States substantially, and it's going to spread to many parts of the country that have been relatively free of fatalities and case occurrences thus far. But just to go back to Sweden, the total death toll in Sweden, a country of about 11 million people, about twice as large in population as Norway, they have 3,000 dead. Okay, and Norway has only 40 dead. If it were the same size as Sweden, it would have a total, okay, of 80 dead. So that's a very stark comparison between Sweden and Norway. So the article asks, but that sacrifice in blood at least saved the country's economy, right? Well, that's the funny part, and not in a ha-ha funny way, says the cost staff. Or says costs. Quote, Sweden's economy is expected to contract between 6.9% and 9.7%, reported CNBC. Meanwhile, this is what the International Monetary Fund expects from other European countries. Italy, 9.1%, Spain, 8%, France, 7.2%, UK, 7%, Germany, 6.5%, Denmark, 6.5%, Finland, 6.0%. Okay. In other words, there is no gain from failing to shut down the economy based on the case, okay, of Sweden. It looks like, in the end, that we will see both more fatalities in Sweden and more cases per capita in Sweden than we will see, okay, in other countries with the same or even greater damage done to the economy in those countries. So Sweden is basically showing the worst of all possible results. It's fair to say that it's experiment, and it was a conscious experiment. They knew they were doing things differently, okay, from other nations. They thought it would work out for them. They were in error, and they've paid a price in blood and haven't saved anything when it comes to the economy, okay, of Sweden. The article says, in a sane world, this controlled experiment would be reason enough for policymakers in the United States to hold back on reopening their states and the country. Instead, those ignoramuses, says Koss, are hell-bent on making the same obvious mistakes, pretending that returning to business as usual will rescue the country from economic calamity. And sure, Republicans are stupid enough to go out and get infected, doing the virus dirty work for it. But the economy isn't going anywhere as long as most people who are sane and smart refuse to put themselves in danger for a movie or a haircut. Or to put another way, it is impossible for the economy to rebound as long as a deadly virus is killing Americans at a clip of several thousand per day. If you don't believe that, just look at Sweden. So, okay, and yes, in the United States, what is being predicted now is that we will shortly be at 3,000 fatalities per day. In fact, just today, we had a gain in fatalities of 3,000 over yesterday. Yesterday morning, we were at 75,000 fatalities. And this morning, we were at 78,000 fatalities. Now, next, I wanted to call your attention to an article in The Nation. And to share that with you. This article is very well written, and I urge you to read it. The title of it is, I Left Norway's Lockdown for the United States. The difference is shocking. And the article is by Ann Jones. She's a journalist, but she's an American journalist who happened to be in Norway. And yesterday at 5 a.m. this was posted. And I'll go through this at some length, but I don't think I have time to read the whole thing. But I urge you to read it because it's very, very good. She says Donald Trump is not a president. He can't even play one on TV. He's a corrupt and dangerous braggart with ill-concealed aspirations for a crown. And with an election coming up, he's been monopolizing prime time every day, spouting self-congratulation and misinformation. And she says, quote, "No, don't inject that Lysol!" Exclamation point. His never-ending absurd performances play out as farce against the tragic background of the COVID-19 pandemic sweeping the nation. If we had a real president, which is to say almost anybody else, things would be different. It would have seen the pandemic coming. It would not have attacked me in my old age. I guess she's fairly old. I don't know how old Ann Jones is. Maybe she'll tell us. I don't believe she told us in this blog post, as I recall, in this article. And most of the dead might still be alive. And she says the records of other countries make this clear. South Korea, Taiwan, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Iceland, New Zealand, and Norway have all had commendable success in protecting their people. Could it be by chance that 7 out of 8 of the most successful nations in combating the COVID-19 pandemic are headed by women? She raises that question. I don't know. Could it be by chance? I'm not going to speculate about that. But she points out that Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, okay, and Mette Frederiksen of Denmark, Sanna Marin of Finland, um, um, Angela Merkel of Germany, Katrin Jakobsdottir of Iceland, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, and Erna Solberg of Norway have all been described in similar terms as calm, confident, and compassionate leaders. The 8th person is the president of South Korea. I forget who the president of South Korea is, but he is the only male in the bunch. I think there's probably some correlation here as well to Social Democrats, but I would not really swear to that. I think Jacinda Ardern is a Social Democrat, and Katrin Jakobsdottir of Iceland is a Social Democrat, and probably Sanna Marin of Finland and Mette Frederiksen, okay, of Denmark, okay, also are Social Democrats. But I'm not sure the other ladies are. I know Angela Merkel is a Christian Democrat, that's a conservative, okay, in Germany. Okay, and Erna Solberg of Norway is also a conservative. And Jones says, all of them have been commended for thorough preparations, quick decisive action, and clear, empathetic communication. Erna Solberg has even been hailed as, quote, Landetsmor, unquote, the mother of her country. Now that is saying something. Perhaps in such disturbing times as these, we feel some primal yearning for a capable, comforting mother. But we need not resort to such psychological speculation. The fortunate countries turn out to be those with the fairness and foresight to have welcomed women into government decades ago. Our United States, of course, is way behind in this respect, as we all know. But that doesn't mean that the women we are welcoming into government now, or that are normally named as possible choices for vice president, are generally on the empathetic side. I don't think people would necessarily say that about Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, and some of the other female candidates, okay, for vice president. But I'm not going to speculate on that, really. I shouldn't have begun to speculate on that. But here we go. What seems anachronistic in this critical time is the presence and leadership posts of so many self-aggrandizing, sociopathic, okay, male autocrats. Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, Viktor Orban of Hungary, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Donald Trump of the United States, and more. Don't forget Duterte of the Philippines. Faced with the pandemic, none of these powerful men had a clue. They encountered an invader that could not be bullied, bribed, banished, or bombed. And for their ignorance and vanity, the people pay and pay and pay. She says, I know something about difference good leadership makes because I've been locked down now in 2 different countries. One kept me safe, the other nearly killed me. Guess which one that was. I happened to be in Norway when the virus arrived and saw firsthand what a well-run government can actually do. Yes, I know Norway seems small when compared to the United States, but both of the governments that locked me down, Norway and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where I now reside, have roughly 5.5 to 6.5 million people, and Norway's capital, Oslo, is only slightly more populous than Boston. So some comparisons may be revelatory. More to the point, with any population, the difference between success and failure is preparation. Swift action and the techniques applied to overcome the pandemic. On February 26th, the Norwegian Institute of Public Health announced the first case of COVID-19, which was a woman who had returned a week earlier from China. The next day, February 27th, it reported 2 cases in travelers returning from Italy and another from Iran. After that came 2 skiers also back from Italy. One of them, an employee of Oslo's largest hospital, went right back to work, where tracers would soon witness just how fast the unseen virus could move. And here's the key that escapes political leaders in America. In Norway, testers and tracers were on the job from the start. As February rolled into March, they were already testing and tracking some 500 Norwegian skiers returning from the Austrian Alps and northern Italy. Some had frequented convivial après-ski taverns there, and once back home were quick to catch up with friends. One Norwegian tracer labeled such skiers, quote, very sociable people, unquote. Systematically, Norway would test all its returning travelers, every one of them, then track down all the contacts of those who had tested positive and test them and their contacts as well, and so on down the line. Working with remarkable speed, the tracers used immediate test results, a tool apparently available in the United States only to the rich and famous, to track the trajectories of the virus as it spread. When cases began to multiply without known contacts, the tracers knew that the virus had begun to hitchhike through an unwitting community and were quick to surround it and shut it down. In response to the pandemic, the government gradually closed down the capital and other centers of contagion. In Oslo, places of assembly went first: theaters, cinemas, concert halls. Norwegians were even asked to stay away from the World Cup ski championships being held at Holmenkollen on the edge of Oslo. Big sacrifice for them. Lost my place for a minute. Schools and universities moved online, while offices of all sorts soon followed suit. The restaurants and bars shut their doors. By March 12th, only 2 weeks after the first reported case, the capital and much of the country had closed down. On that day, in fact, the officials reported the death of an elderly man, the first Norwegian casualty of COVID-19. on March the 12th. Now, we started doing something about COVID 19, I believe, if I recall, on March the 15th. Some of the modelers, the epidemiologists have estimated that if Donald Trump had taken vigorous action only 2 weeks earlier, by March the 3rd, as they had started to do in Norway. It wasn't that they shut down at that point, but they were tracing and testing very vigorously at that point. And as soon as they saw it spread, they shut down. Only 2 weeks after the first reported case, we did not do that. Had Trump shut things down by March the 2nd, only 2 weeks earlier, it's estimated that 90% of the fatalities we've had in America would have been avoided. In other words, instead of 78,000 fatalities by this time, we would be looking at only 7,800 fatalities. Going on with the article. By mid-April, some 5 weeks after the shutdown went into effect, the government began to open up public life again, proceeding carefully, step by step. So they opened up 5 weeks after the shutdown. We've been shut now for more than 5 weeks, if I recall correctly, and we've still got a problem. Toddlers were the first to return to their preschools on April 20th, with grade schoolers to follow. By April 30th, Norway had administered 172,586 tests and recorded 7,667 positive cases of COVID-19, 2,221 of them in Oslo. The dead numbered 207, suggesting a per capita mortality rate lower than that of any other European country, and far from America's tragic loss of life. But how to explain this record in Norway? And of course, it's attributed to the early preparations and the depth of the preparations, which allowed them to respond very, very quickly. It was a painstaking effort, backed by their universal healthcare system. It enabled the state to get ahead of the virus, save lives, and stop the pandemic. Short. The country's remarkably effective welfare system has bolstered its population throughout the shutdown. Furloughed workers drew full pay from the government for 20 days, and about 62% of their full salaries after that. They'll return to their jobs ready for work in factories, shops, and businesses as the quarantine is lifted. The government's effective and well-targeted expenditures are ensuring smooth transitions, a quick return to production, and best of all in this troubled time, some peace of mind for employers, workers, and families. The shutdown is bound to be costly, perhaps the worst blow to the economy since World War II. But such thoroughgoing, bottom-up arrangements are less expensive in both financial and human terms than America's striking neglect of marginal, aka essential, workers thrown under the bus of crony capitalism with nothing but lectures on the overrated American freedom to fend for yourself. In Norway, the invasion of COVID-19 was seen from the outset as a national problem and part of a global emergency. And this is key, folks. It was never politicized. Norway's conservative prime minister, um, 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 a neoliberal in this case, Erna Solberg, is now receiving high marks indeed, even from opposition parties, for her calm leadership. Children like her too. During the crisis, she gave two nationwide, quote, press conferences to children to answer questions they submitted about the pandemic, such as, quote, can I have a birthday party, unquote. Quote again, how long does it take to make a vaccine, unquote. From the outset, she told them it was okay to be scared, and then she set an example of what a smart, hardworking leader in a collaborative, many-party parliament can do for all the people, even in scary times. Remarkably, Norway very quickly achieved the lowest rate of contagion in Europe. From the start, it aimed to stifle the virus to the point where one infected person might infect only one more. In scientific terms, it aimed for an R0 rate, that is, a rate of reproduction of 1.0. By the time Solberg announced that goal on March 24th, however, the magic number had already fallen to 0.71. Today, with only 81 COVID patients hospitalized and their contacts already traced and tested, Norwegians can begin to return with considerable confidence to something that edges ever closer to normal life. Okay. I want to point out here that in my county, which is Loudoun County, okay, in just one county over from Fairfax, still close to Washington, D.C., in the northern part of my state, we've had about 20 fatalities. And if I recall correctly, 80 COVID patients who were hospitalized, okay, in this particular county. In Norway, today, they have only 81 COVID patients who are hospitalized, and their contacts are already traced and tested. So Norwegians can begin to return with considerable confidence to something that edges ever closer to a normal life. On the other hand, the United States become an example of just the opposite, a corrupt government unprepared for and even in denial of warnings from within and without. Years ago, President Obama created within the National Security Council a directorate for global health security and biodefense to prepare for the pandemics sure to come. That directorate even briefed the incoming Trump team on the urgency of pandemic preparations before the president's inauguration. But on taking office, Trump eliminated the threat by eliminating the directorate. That was his way, okay, of eliminating the threat. And we've been paying the price ever since. Because Trump was informed of a viral outbreak in Wuhan, China in early January. But he ignored the message. He wasted at least 2 months in self-serving fantasies. He could have started testing and tracing almost immediately, as soon as the first case was recorded. But he did not. He could have shut down travel to the United States long before he did, but he did not. Claiming the pandemic would disappear of its own accord or was fake news or a new hoax by Democrats plotting his downfall. By March, his conduct had become increasingly erratic, obtuse, combative, and often just flat-out nasty. In April, he abandoned altogether his most pressing presidential duty, first claiming, quote, total power, unquote, as president, and then shifting the job of testing and protecting the people from an unrestrained pandemic onto state governors already struggling to find basic medical supplies for frontline healthcare personnel in their own states. Worse, he roused his most militant followers, some heavily armed, to defy the emergency directors of several states led by Democratic governors. In other words, he was highly, highly partisan, as he still is today. In short, he first unloaded the responsibilities of his office onto state governors, then made it his mission to undermine and threaten some of them. For good measure, he cut off U.S. funding for the World Health Organization, the single UN agency best equipped to deal with global health emergencies. Trump already had a proud record of getting away with highly offensive, even criminal acts in plain sight. Now, through egotism, and also bravado, and just plain ignorance, he's made an epidemic great again. That is MEGA, mega, make an epidemic great again. For COVID-19 cases and fatalities in the United States have by now far surpassed those anywhere else on Earth. But to be fair, not on a per million basis. We're still only 230 fatalities per million. But watch us over the next month when we're anticipated to have something like 90,000 more fatalities. Let's check things at the end of May and see whether we're still at that 230 million, that 230 per million rates, or whether we're way, way higher. See whether we've reached the high of Belgium, or Italy, or Spain. On March 11th, as Oslo was shutting down, Trump issued an order to take effect in 72 hours. No one flying from Europe would be allowed to enter the United States. It sounded crazy, but worried about worse to come, I changed my flight home to meet the deadline. The next day, the American embassy clarified the president's ultimatum. The travel ban did not apply to U.S. Citizens. By that time, of course, it was impossible for me to change my ticket back. So I left Oslo on March 14th after assuring friends that I would be okay, because Massachusetts, home of Elizabeth Warren, is a progressive state. Ha! She says. Changing planes in London, I found myself in a different world. Packed into the tail section of that flight, in the middle of a crowd of American students summoned home from European colleges by their anxious parents. Some were in transit from northern Italy, already the heartland of the European COVID-19 outbreak. From the seats behind me came insistent sounds of boys coughing. The flight attendants wore rubber gloves and made themselves scarce. I wrapped a long scarf round and round my face, feeling as if somehow I'd been suckered into a trap. 7 hours later, we stumbled into Boston's Logan Airport, destined to spend a few more, all too intimate hours together. I crept along a zigzag trail in the middle of those coughing boys, with no way of putting distance between us to the passport inspectors and then beyond. Finally, one by one, we were ushered into a curtained area to experience the airport's first night of official, quote, screening, unquote. I was pleased to think that we were all at least to be tested for the virus, but no such luck. When my turn came, the official screener voiced no greetings, asked no questions, offered nothing but a single order. Quote, "Go home and take your temperature," unquote. Had I been held all that time among those coughing boys for this? Later that week, a local paper reported approvingly that new airport screening, the first line of defense against the foreign plague, took, quote, less than a minute, unquote. I was angry to have been forced into that dangerous flight by the president's arbitrary edict, and doubly angry that he had terminated travel from Europe without consulting any of his European counterparts. By the look of things that evening, no one from his administration had even informed key American airports receiving flights from Europe until the last minute. I saw a bunch of those coughing boys board a Silver Line bus into Boston and others grabbing taxis. And so we all went off into the night, apparently leaving behind no trace of the state of our health or where we were headed. Some days later, I was not merely angry, but very ill. 10 days after that, in a hospital parking garage, a masked nurse worked a giant Q-tip up my nose. A doctor told me to quarantine myself at home, as I'd been doing anyway, until I got the test results in about 5 days. And she'd started showing symptoms. She could have been dead in 5 days. That was probably about the 8th day. Incredible. Until I got the test results in about 5 days. But why should it take so long? Wasn't the whole point of a test to learn what was going on as quickly as possible? The speed of the test result had been the very point in Norway, combined with the immediate work of the tracers that enabled the National Health Service. Yes, they have a National Health Service. It's not even a Medicare for All program. It's a National Health Service in Norway, to stay ahead of the pandemic, and in the end, essentially, to shut it down. She said, I went home and got worse. 5 days passed with no word. On the 12th day, I felt well enough to call my doctor, who tracked down the result of my test, just in, quote unquote. It was positive, but almost 2 weeks old. So over the telephone, the doctor gave me the all clear to put on my mask, a souvenir of my trip to the ER, and go forth to shop, knowing no Norwegian doctor would turn me loose so soon without another test. I asked for one. Sorry, short supply, only one to a customer. I've kept myself in quarantine at home ever since. Well, I'll refrain from reading the rest of this, but she talks about the death, of an immigrant from Guatemala, who worked at a Walmart and who worked herself to death. She talked about not having paid leave, as in Norway, not being able to see your own doctor in the National Health Service when you fall ill. She asks about the tests. What useful information, did it give anyone? She said, I'd walked home from the ER in the dark so as not to endanger others by taking a bus, and she'd gone to bed. Nobody checked up on her because nobody knew my test was positive, something, of course, I didn't know either. And throughout those nearly 2 weeks of waiting for the test results, no tracer called to learn if I live with other people who might be endangered, and available for testing. And had I died in my bed, no one would or could have traced that bright red line between me, those coughing boys, and Donald Trump's executive order, which resulted in my compulsory flight to a state caught totally off guard in a country both dysfunctional and unprepared. On April 20th, 5 weeks after I returned to Boston, Massachusetts was designated as a COVID-19 hotspot, with 38,077 cases and 1,706 deaths at that time. State stood in third place behind New York, and New Jersey. Would that have happened if we had immediate tests for those coughing boys coming back, and those tests were given immediately and they were contact traced? Would Massachusetts have had 38,077 cases and 1,706 deaths? She says about being third, this was not an honor, but it may be what prompted Governor Charlie Baker to turn to testing and belatedly to tracing. Yeah, belatedly, about 5 weeks too late. The number of new cases in this state was rising every day, as it has from the first reported case in February. The governor holds a press conference every day explaining we're now right in the middle of an expected surge, apparently unaware that a surge is what you get when you have missed the moment for preventive testing and tracing. This is also what you get when, as in a nation's capital, politicians rather than scientists run the show. Belatedly, Massachusetts started testing people at the rate of about 9,000 per day, while hiring private agencies funded by the state are in the process of hiring perhaps 1,000 tracers to conduct phone interviews with the contacts of all Massachusetts residents who have already tested positive. Today, May 6th, our official positives number is 70,271, although 4,212 of us are already dead. Maybe in Massachusetts, more than 90% would have been saved if they had only done testing and tracing of those coming in from outside of the country at Logan Airport. It's just criminal, folks. It's just criminal. She points out tracers in Norway have already moved on to other tests to find asymptomatic carriers who may be contagious or perhaps have developed antibodies to the disease. Anyone in that country with even the mildest symptoms may ask for a test. These precautionary studies are essential in case the virus should find new life as the quarantine is lifted. And then she finishes, what scientists might learn from such studies like the new contact tracing one in Massachusetts remains to be seen. But surely one inescapable conclusion is that this virus is smarter, more agile, and faster on its feet than any of its associates we've met before, or for that matter than most of our public officials from a failed president on down. And for any readers who believe in politics more than science, let me just say that without science, you won't even know what hit you. You want to read the whole thing yourself. It's a great piece. It's a great piece. And worth the time I've spent on it. So, next, as a Medium post by Umair Haque, is Donald Trump's response to the virus a crime against humanity? And Hague says that we're going to hit 200,000 plus deaths, of which 90% are needless. He says, take a deep breath, go to your happy place, or you're going to need it. Approximately 90% of American COVID-19 deaths can now be attributed to the administration's delay between March 2nd and March 16th. That from the nation's top epidemiologists, and the link to that is to an article in the Washington Post. Read that again. 90% of coronavirus deaths are needless. Of course, he might have started even before March 2nd. There's nothing magical about March 2nd. He knew about this threat from January 2nd. He could have marshaled resources of the federal government to meet that for the whole month of January. And by the beginning of February, he could have been on top of it with testing and with tracing. The WHO tests were available by then. The United States could have used those tests. It says, two, quote, the people of our country are warriors. Will some people be affected? Yes. Will some people be affected badly? Yes. But we have to get our country opened, unquote. That's Donald Trump, known to some people as, quote, the president, unquote. Translation, America, you're expendable. Okay, it says Umair Haque, okay, in Medium. I told you you'd need to take a deep breath. How does that make you feel? Angry, white hot, astonished, bewildered, all the above perhaps, but are you really outraged and angry enough, as much as you should be? When he wrote this, north of 1,500 people are dying per day. No, it's now 3,000. By June 1st, America's predicted this by the White House's own projections to have 3,000 deaths a day, the equivalent of 9/11 of a 9/11 every day. Trump's plan to reopen the economy, which won't reopen the economy because you can't make people go out and spend money, it's going to make that figure explode. It'll surge north of the currently estimated 3,000 deaths per day. Let me say all that even more precisely. So far, about 70%, 70,000 people have died of coronavirus. 90,000 of those 70,000 coronavirus deaths are already needless. That's about 63,000 people. This fact doesn't seem to have sunken into the American psyche or collective consciousness yet. Perhaps it's too ugly, too nightmarish to really bad, or maybe Americans, as the world thinks, really are brutish. I'll withhold judgment on that score. Let's just do the math. There are already 63,000 people who've died as a result of negligence and inaction on the part of an administration that's done. Everything it can do to handle a global pandemic irresponsibly. First, it denied there was any problem. Then it waffled. Then it set states against each other. Then it actually blockaded shipments of vital supplies. Anyone remember that? And doled them out as political favors. Then it cut funding for the WHO, an action the editor-in-chief of the Lancet, one of the world's top science journals, described as a crime against humanity, unquote. This administration has done everything it can do to utterly mishandle a pandemic. A cynic might even say, well, what did you expect from the kinds of men who put kids in cages and camps? That they'd nobly ride to your rescue or use death on an unimaginable scale for political gain? But I digress, I suppose. But now the Trump regime is about to add disaster to catastrophe on a scale so large it's going to make history. Let's look into the future. We are already at 60,000 plus needless deaths, but that number is now set to explode. Well, this blog was a little behind in terms of dates and fatalities. Of course, we're now at 78,000 with 7,000 some odd of them being deaths we might have suffered anyway, but 70,000 of them being needless deaths. This is again a fact that Americans don't want to consider, can't seem to reflect on, and yet it's horrifically true. That is, Donald Trump and his administration are responsible for 70,000 needless deaths today. Today. Now, the White House's own projections forecast something close to 200,000 deaths by July or so, at the rate of 3,000 per day by June. But it's 3,000 per day, and that was 3,000 per day or close to it this morning. Go ahead and do the math. 3,000 people a day times 30 days is 90,000 more deaths. It may be 90,000 more deaths by June 8th or June 9th, not by the end of June. Months of that added up and shudder. What did I say when we first started with this and first reported on the coronavirus? I said the potential for deaths was as high as 3.3 million Americans if nothing was done. Now, we've done something, we've done a few things, but what we've done is inadequate. And now we're reopening again. So maybe it won't be 3.3 million. Maybe it'll only be the 2.2 million that was projected in the epidemiological models about 3 to 4 weeks ago. Folks, only 400,000 Americans died in World War II. In World War II. We could be approaching that by the end of July. The way we're going. Add it up and shudder, he said. Yes, that's just the beginning. Because of those, those projections don't factor in, quote, reopening the economy. Well, mine do. Which I put in quotes because, as we've already discussed, reopening the economy won't reopen the economy, but will simply spike the spread and death toll of the pandemic, accelerating it. But Donald Trump thinks he can order people back to work by threatening the loss of their jobs. That is what he thinks. That's what the neoliberal capitalists think. The economy isn't going to magically reopen just because Donald Trump wants it to. You can't grab an economy by the pussy. Sorry. Trying to reopen it right now is only going to cause both mass death and a depression. And you can see we're in a depression already, folks. The unemployment levels are at a depression. And I'll get into that a little bit later. For the simple reason that as a pandemic accelerates, frightened people will still simply stay home. And shops and businesses and hotels and bars and restaurants will largely be empty, or at least empty enough to cause a tidal wave of bankruptcy, which will lead to permanent layoffs, not just furloughs. You can force people to go back to work, but you can't make anyone spend their money, especially during a mounting crisis. Bang! There goes public health and the economy, says Umair Haque. And the article goes along further in that same vein. He also says about the spread, of the disease. He thinks the daily death rate will skyrocket when people are forced to go back to work. He thinks it will go from 3,000 a day to maybe 5,000. 5,000 people dying a day for 30 days, that's 150,000 deaths per month. That way beats World War II. Those 400,000 deaths were over what? 4 years, 48 months. At the rate of 150,000 deaths per month, we'll surpass that in 3 months. He says a growing wave of deaths will become a tsunami, one which will be by and large needless. How many of those will be needless? At least 90%, as epidemiologists already point out. The truth is closer to 100% of them, because reopening the economy will have no benefit whatsoever. What do you think sane and normal people will do as the death rate skyrockets beyond belief? Happily go out to the bar, restaurant, shop, mall, store, take a vacation and stay at that lovely hotel? Apart from the fringe of lunatic by liberation lockdown protesters, by regular people will hunker down at home, frightened out of their wits, holding on to every last penny they have. Bang! Reopening the economy too soon proposes both depression and the human tragedy of mass death. So, he goes on in this vein, points out hitting a full 500,000 seems like, okay, it's eminently plausible. And then he says, as if on cue, there Trump is telling Americans plainly that they're expendable. They're warriors who need to sacrifice themselves, in this case martyrs, to the futile cause of reopening an economy too soon, which simply can't be done by anyone. Already 90% of deaths, 60,000 plus people, are needless. And he says America's engaging in self-inflicted catastrophe on a scale that beggars belief. It is about to embark on a course of disaster without parallel in modern history. Does that make you shudder? Maybe, maybe not. It should. But Americans are different, at least some of them. Enough of them that the American idiots become a global legend. In America at the moment, there's something very much like mass indifference to mass death. Sure, you might care, and your friends might care, and even Don Lemon might be moved to impotent and rage tears about it on CNN. But society as a whole appears to be shruggingly indifferent. Americans still gather in Central Park and on Long Beach as if they don't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, South Korea has achieved the milestone of no coronavirus deaths because its citizens appear to actually care about one another, as the citizens of Norway appear to care about one another as well, and the citizens of New Zealand. Okay, and Umair says, that's not a rant. It's a call, I suppose, for some kind of not even sanity, just common decency to prevail. No society should be as indifferent to death on an unthinkable scale as America appears to be right now. Like I said, why isn't it common knowledge that 90% of coronavirus deaths are needless, that they were avoidable? Are Americans clueless in a benign way, or clueless because they're indifferent? And he goes on in this vein and points out that a society's been broken in spirit, in mind, in thought, in action, when its citizens are indifferent to 500,000 of their fellow citizens needlessly dying. He says such a society cannot have a future. It has ceased to be a society in anything but name. You see, for us to be a society, I must at minimum care whether you live or die needlessly. If I am happily cheering on your needless death just so that I can go get a drink at my local bar, we aren't a society. We're rivals, adversaries, enemies. It's perfectly okay with me that you and your kids die as long as I get my short-term pleasure. But when that's the case, not only have I become the demagogue's easiest target and clay to mold, I've also become the kind of person incapable of any of the following things: democracy, civilization, freedom, justice, decency, common humanity. I'm a creature of aggression, hostility, and cruelty, of narrow individualism, so extreme that the rest of us dying to me makes no difference whatsoever. Bang! There goes civilization. unquote, from Umair Haque. And then he goes on. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it's well worth reading, and I commend it to you. It's well worth reading. But that's enough of it, because we still have left one more post. This time from Truthout, based on the interview from Amy Goodman. Reporter Laurie Garrett warns COVID-19 pandemic may last 36 months or more. Where did she get that? There's a picture, okay, of Laurie Garrett there. This one is by Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez of Democracy Now! And they did a transcript of the interview. I'm not going to read everything through it. Amy Goodman points out that we could reach 3,000 deaths a day by June 1st. Again, this was done on May 6th. It's now the 9th. As of May 6th, the death toll was 71,000. By the 7th, it was 73,000. By the 8th, it was 75,000, some odd. Maybe 75,500 or something like that. By this morning, it was 78,000, some odd, moving quickly towards the 3,000 per day figure. I think it's going to be 3,000 deaths a day way before June 1st. Maybe in 2 or 3 days from now. We'll know more tomorrow morning when we look at it. Donald Trump says we've flattened the curve and we're ready for a gradual reopening, okay, of our country. Okay, Amy Goodman quotes, "We can't keep our country closed for the next 5 years." And Donald Trump says it's a dangerous enemy, it's a bad enemy. We're saying people are over 60, 65, but over 60 we're even saying sort of, stay back for a while. We recommend you staying back for a while. Thanks, Donald. I really needed you to tell me that. At the same time, with young children and children, we'd like to see the schools open early next season and on time. Amy Goodman says, Vice President Mike Pence said the task force is expected to disband by the end of May. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington estimates there will be nearly 135,000 deaths in the United States by the beginning of August. Folks, that is way an underestimate. It is way, an underestimate. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, as good as it is, the IHME has continually underestimated the amount of deaths. They were still predicting 60,000 deaths on the morning when we reached 60,000 deaths, which was maybe 8 days ago or 7 days ago or something like that. So it was kind of an oops moment. They had been predicting 60,000 deaths for a long time. Then they quickly revised the estimates to 135,000 by the beginning of August, still miscalculating how quickly the fatalities were multiplying in this country. So now we come to the interview with Laurie Garrett. She says at least two different models, including one a government model, predict we're almost going to double the size of our death toll between now and the end of June. And I think it's going to be before that, of course. Yet the president has decided, let's roll up the tent, bring in the Circus Act. Come on, everybody. Laurie, I wanted to ask you one, Gonzalez says. So the death toll, the United States is about 4% of the world's population, yet it has, with all the money spent on health care in this country, 25% of more than 25% of the deaths worldwide. And in recent days, it's gone as high as 1/3 of all the deaths in the world are occurring right here in the U.S. And Laurie says, yeah. And she says, what's your sense of the reason for that? Well, it's very obvious we have a patchwork response. We don't have a unified national response to the virus. We don't have any uniform standards, no guidances. The CDC is virtually mum. It's been numbed and silenced. And we're operating as if every local mayor, every local governor has equal capacity to make appropriate choices and decide how best to fight this disease. And that's, of course, simply ludicrous. And so you can drive from one county to another, from one state to another, completely different policies being executed. And they're all competing. They're competing to get their economies going. They're competing to get masks. They're competing to get PPEs, medicines, healthcare workers, ambulances, the burial details. It's insane. We've pitted each component of America against each other for resources, for policy, for response. And now the president has raised the stakes and said, quote, and for your economy, unquote. So Amy says, so Laurie, if you could start at the beginning, we see countries like Taiwan, which is right next to China, with extremely few deaths immediately, seeing the need of the supply chain and making sure there was personal protective equipment, there was gear, there was testing right from the beginning. President Trump continually repeats that he was the one against all advice that instituted a travel ban against China very early on. But doesn't that undercut his very case for preparedness, that if he understood early on what this was about, why he didn't at the same time or before, Dr. Bright has been saying he was warning this way before, why he didn't immediately gear up the testing, gear up the making of the protective gear like other countries did? Take us back to the beginning and talk about what has happened from the beginning that led to this catastrophe in this country. Well, Amy, for those of us that went through the SARS epidemic, and I was in China during the SARS epidemic in Hong Kong, the warning signs were obvious, and they were obvious in the window of time roughly about 3 or 4 days before Christmas, going all the way through to New Year's Eve. It was very obvious that a terrible epidemic was unfolding, that it looked like SARS or was similar to SARS, that healthcare workers were panicking. The social media all over Wuhan was full of fear and rumors, and all the signals that those of us that follow China have come to accept are the signals that something is out of control in that country. And if I could see it sitting here in my living room or my office and simply monitoring what's available on the internet, if I could see that this was happening, then certainly the CIA was seeing it, Defense Intelligence Agency was seeing it, and a whole variety of other intelligence operations within the U.S. government were aware of it. And we know, in fact, they were trying to brief the White House. They were directly briefing the president, but he was ignoring it, and he had other things on his mind, including the impeachment trial. And so that was unfolding on this side, a kind of, quote, let's just ignore it. And on the Chinese side, what was unfolding was a deliberate cover-up that extended out until January 20th. So you had 6 to 8 weeks of transmission of this virus going on in Hubei province in Wuhan. And it was basically being lied about, and they were reporting false figures to the WHO. They were distorting the information about it to the world and the rest of China until Xi Jinping really ordered transparency, and that was on January 19th. Well, that might be, but Donald Trump knew about this on January 2nd. So he had warning by then. So you saw this huge jump in the reported number of cases between January 19th and January 20th. So he certainly had warning by January 20th, right? He didn't have to keep ignoring it until March. Because all of a sudden you know, quote, okay, bring all those hidden files out of the shelves and tell the world the truth or some semblance of the truth, unquote. And we institute our travel ban as a primary tactic to deal with this imminent plague, and it becomes the only policy, really, that Trump is willing to settle for. And it fits nicely with an overarching policy he had vis-a-vis China in terms of tariffs, reducing their trade with the U.S., holding their feet to the fire for our economic relationship. So saying, quote, okay, no more flights from Wuhan, no more flights from China, unquote, was a comfort zone for the president. It fits. And as countries around the world were doing battle with the outbreak, there was a sort of shrug on this side of the ocean, sort of, well, you know, it's not coming here, that's over there, it's not us. Of course, inside the government, every agency responsible for such things has their hair on fire, saying, quote, this is actually an imminent threat, we need to get prepared, we should be doing X, Y, and Z, but it's being ignored. Now the countries you named, Amy and Juan, are countries that had been through SARS, so Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam. These countries all said, okay, we've seen this bad guy before and we know this is what you've got to do when a coronavirus comes in the front door, unquote. And they took very, very strong steps very immediately, and they activated all the networks they had created after their SARS experience in 2003, or the MERS experience in the case of South Korea in 2015. They said, all right, let's get ready. This is how we respond, unquote. And response included testing, contact tracing, placing people into quarantine, just aggressively bringing it, keeping it small. Don't let it spread outwards. But that was not the response in the United States. And by the time the president wakes up and is presented with two separate sets of studies that have models projecting the scale of what we're up against with the possibility of 2 million dead, we've already got the horses out of the barn, as they say. We've already got cases in the United States. In fact, we're focused on Seattle area of Washington State, a terrible outbreak in that area. But indeed, the virus has already seeded all over the United States, and we have a huge epidemic pouring in by then from Europe to the east coast of the United States. So all the eyes are on China and blocking travel from China, but in fact, it's pouring into New York via mostly European tourists, and we're being swamped. Yep. And one asks about a COVID-19 case in France as early as December of last year, and there was also West Nile virus, there was H1N1. What about the early warning systems of the advanced countries? And Laurie said, well, we've been accustomed, Juan, to thinking of outbreaks as over there, you know, somewhere else. The sort of stereotype of an outbreak was it was occurring in this poor country, probably Africa, that it was in a remote area, then it got into a city in a developing country, and this was a model. And the role of the CDC was to fly in and provide advice and set up testing and do all the things that supposedly we're supposed to be doing here. And we had set up a vast apparatus under the Obama administration that built on things already set up under the Bush administration for training overseas, for building up infrastructures, for rapid identification, of disease and response. And we had programs for doing that here in the United States. I have, for example, on my shelf here, excuse me for going out of camera for a moment, this big monster, 2005. This was put together under the Bush administration, and it has blow-by-blow details of how each agency in the United States was supposed to respond if we had a lethal pandemic influenza in America. So we have playbooks. We had multiple playbooks. Every administration was setting them up, but the Trump administration came in with a very different attitude, and most of the playbooks were thrown out. The agencies and the subsets of departments were dismantled. The whole Obama Global Health Security Initiative, that it set up to train 194 countries in the world in how to spot and respond to an emerging disease was all but just completely dismantled. The CDC was cut back by 20%. We can go on and on. You've all read the articles now. You all know the scale of this catastrophic lack of actual preparedness. And then there comes to the whole point of, a kind of hubris issue. I mean, Italy has been wiped out, just devastated by COVID. It's not a coincidence it's Italy, because this is a country where the anti-vaccine movement has been enormous, where members of the government have actually been opposed to vaccination and have called for scientists to go mum and stop telling us what to do. It was caught unawares, unprepared, and with a kind of smug attitude that if they kept the immigrants, the riffraff, from Africa and the Middle East out, they wouldn't face these problems. And we have a similar attitude in much of the rest of Europe, and certainly here in the U.S., that always associates the threat of infectious disease with immigration. So if you're barring immigration, you're protecting yourself from disease. This is ludicrous, Well, the disease got into the United States. It got into Europe via completely legitimate travelers, tourism, business, a globalized business economy, all things that we promote. There's more. I'm not going to go through all the rest of this, but you get the picture. I do want to dwell for a minute on what she thinks about how long it's going to last. She talks about the herd immunity, approach. And she says, well, the problem is that increasingly we're getting evidence, first of all, of people who can be reinfected. And this is hardly controversial. We don't know. Did they ever really completely clear the virus in the first place? In other words, is it like HIV, where the virus seems to be gone from your body? Routine testing finds no virus. You feel okay, but actually it's simply retreated into types of cells that are not easily found in blood or survival tests, so it's been missed on nasal tests, and so in fact, it's reactivated. So it's not a reinfection, it's a reactivation or latent infection, if you will, or the tests themselves are lousy and you just missed it. It was there all along. Or the third option says you didn't actually develop, have a neutralizing antibody response. Now, this is the phrase that gets bandied about, but a lot of people don't really know what it means, including people saying it. So let's be really clear. The immune system is a very complex system of defense. It has a cellular system. There are special cells that find enemies and eat them up, and send messages out signaling to antibodies to come in, which are not cells, which are actually molecules. And so there's a cellular response. There's what's called an innate response, which is the kind of thing you get when you have hay fever and so on. And then there's an antibody response. Now, when you get a good vaccine, what that does is activate your neutralizing antibody response, and what's called called memory of the disease. So for the rest of your life, or however long it lasts, you have memory in your immune system. When this enemy shows up again, your antibodies that are neutralizing, meaning they latch on and they bring in the whole army of the responding immune system, come in and attack and destroy, is activated. And then she talks about this, but on the bottom line of what she has to say is that we're likely to have waves of this coming and going. It's the wave model. We're setting a bad example for the whole world, where different areas of our country, one by one, are getting affected, but not all at the same time, and not really constrained in any one region, or any one uh, area. So after talking about China and the pointing of fingers, okay, between the United States and China as to how this started, she says, so at a moment when a massive scale collaboration is necessary, and let's be clear, we're going to have to vaccinate 7.5 billion human beings against that. It'll be the largest vaccination effort that has ever been imagined in the history of our species. When that is being revved up in Europe, and there's a desperate desire to see Asian countries, okay, European countries, African countries, Latin American countries, all collaborating with a common mission, and the United States is saying, bye, guys. Amy points out, okay, that you said that you can see the pandemic going on for like 36 months. I think people are cringing all over hearing this right now. But if you can lay out the scenario, what exactly does that mean? She says, well, 36 months is my best case scenario. Worst case is that it becomes a new permanent feature on the landscape for generations to come. I think we have to first of all put aside this image, okay, of a wave as a uniform tsunami wave coming across, boom, 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 everybody gets hit at once, we're all in lockdown, and then the wave is gone, and now we can come out and hit the beach. It's not like that. If you haven't been paying attention, it's already not a single isolated wave. Part of the country is starting to get their first cases. Other parts of the country is starting to have a downturn, such as here in New York, where a horrible, horrible epidemic is beginning to come down. This is how it's going to be for months and months to come. The sporadic outbreaks here, there, actually moving towards the southern hemisphere, coming back to the northern hemisphere. Different parts of the world hit at different times. And the movement, people, is going to be the movement of the virus. So as people come out of not just lockdown in their homes, but out of their countries and back on airplanes, out of sort of trying to operate business via Zoom into business via personal contact, as the supply trains try to restore full-scale operation with global distribution. And that means the global movement of people. And we're going to once again have sporadic outbreaks. So it's Italy today, it's Portugal tomorrow, it's Albania next week, it's Rio 2 weeks later, and so on and so forth. And this is going to go on for a very long time. Meanwhile, let's say my 36-month scenario is if we have very good luck on a vaccine. So let us pretend that we actually do come up with a very effective vaccine, totally safe, and so on. It doesn't need to be refrigerated. So she states all kinds of ideal conditions for the vaccine. And then she says, well, that's groovy. It's super effective and everything. It's groovy. Okay, but then she asks, who has it? Who's making it? Where are the factories? And who's going to get it? Well, obviously, it's going to go to the rich countries first, and it's going to the country that's making it first. So if China beats everybody to the mark, then Chinese will get vaccinated. That's 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of doses to manufacture before anybody else in the world gets the vaccine. If it's here, we're going to make 300 million doses. It's going to be Americans first. Then we'll help our Canadian friends, and probably bottom of our list will be Mexico. And this sort of scenario will play out. But meanwhile, it's going to cost money. People are going to want to make a profit off of it. There's going to be patent disputes. There's going to be all sorts of international distribution issues that will get in the way. And this epidemic will keep circulating and keep popping up all over the world. And we won't have a campaign for actually getting 7.5 billion human beings vaccinated. And without vaccinating 7.5 billion, we will continue to have COVID in the world. And if there's any frailty in this herd immunity and in this vaccine protection that we've built, then we'll have waves of it coming back over and over again for years to come. And I see no indication of a mass vaccination campaign coming under gear that would be the largest in the history of humanity, would dwarf what we did with smallpox. And that's basically the interview. And that's really, really, okay, a scary interview. And Laurie Garrett is well known. She's a former senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the very centers of neoliberalism and globalization worldwide. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning science writer and the author, okay, of a number of books. So what she thinks is going to circulate. It's going to circulate. And a lot of people are going to accept it. Of course, not Donald Trump, because he hates the Council on Foreign foreign relations. He dislikes it intensely. Before I end here tonight, I want to say something about unemployment because, of course, the April reports have come out. They don't contain or take into account the last week in April because that ended, okay, in May, okay, in early May. So that, okay, is not actually accounted for here. But it's still good to take a look at the figures. I've left the link to the BLS table on this, but I want to point to certain conclusions without actually sharing the table. First, I want to note that the labor force participation rates, the basis on which we compute unemployment rates, peaked at 67.3% in early 2000. And it's been going down at various points since that time. But we know that if the economy is operating at full cylinders in a boom time, with close to a full employment economy, we know that the labor participation rate can expand to 67.3% because it did so during the Clinton era in early 2000, at the very end of the Clinton era in early 2000. So I want you to keep that figure, okay, in mind. Now, in January of 2020, which was just about the peak of Trump's contentions that he had a wonderful economy, unprecedented, the labor force participation rate was 63.4% of the civilian institutional population, non-institutional population, which was something like, I think, 259 million in January of 2020. Yes, 259,502,000 according to the table here. So the labor force had a recent peak of 164 million. 606,000 people in January of 2000, okay, in 20. That's a labor force participation rate of 63.4%, not 67.3%. That rate corresponded to a number of employed people of 158,714. There were still, okay, a number of unemployed people then. When you look at that table A1, which I've linked to, you will see that that's very, very close to 6 million people, as I've been saying. In January of 2020, before the disease hit, the unemployment rate was about 3.4%. okay, at that time, but it was deceptive because the labor participation rate was not 67.3%, but 63.4% only. So the number of employed were 158,714,000. By April of 2020, the non-institutional population had grown to 259,800, okay, and 96. So it had grown, okay, a little bit. But the labor force participation rate fell to 60.2%. And the labor force actually participating was 156,481. Now, the number of employed people, however, had fallen from that previous figure, okay, I just quoted. Oh, let me get that again. Of 158,714, that figure had fallen. I'm sorry, 158,714,000 had fallen to 133,403,000. So that's a fall of more than 25 million employed people. Now, you've been seeing an unemployment rate actually reported, that's the U3 unemployment rate, of 14.7%. Now, that's computed from the number of employed divided by the size of the labor force, 133 million divided by 156 million. That comes to 85.3%, so the number of unemployed is 14.7%. However, if the labor force had been 67.3% of 259,800 and 96,000, then the labor force would have been 174,910,000. So we know we can have a labor force that's 67.3% of the civilian, non-institutional population. We know that is possible. That is the potential of the economy. We know that because we reached it in the year 2000. So let's call the gap between that potential and the actual number of people who are employed. Let's call that the number of people who are disemployed, okay, by the economy. Let's call that the number of people who would most probably take full-time jobs if they had the option to take the full-time jobs. That means that as of the end of April of 2020, the difference between 174,910,000 and 133,403,000 is 41.5 million people. That's the number of people who are disemployed at this time. However, in those April statistics, the last 3.2 million that we found out about last the Thursday were not counted in those April statistics. So we have to add those 3.2 million to the number of disemployed people. And then this past Thursday, the one just passed, has come, I shouldn't say that, this week has now come and gone. It's nearly Sunday, but we won't get the new unemployment statistics until this coming Thursday. But there likely to be, okay, another 3 million. So in other words, the bottom line is we have to add another 6.2 million to the disemployed for a grand total of 47.7 million people who are currently disemployed. Now that's a disemployment rate of 27.3% of the potential labor force. And that is probably an underestimate. So as well as having the deaths going into an escalation, we have the rate of disemployment going into an escalation and coming very, very close. Well, in other words, being at true depression levels. That 27.3% figure is more comparable to the top depression rate of 24.9% that we had during the Depression of the 1930s, because that was not what the U3 statistic is now. It was a more liberal definition, okay, of unemployment. So it's much more similar to the disemployment rate that I've given you. So what I'm saying is that our unemployment rates are not at 14.7%. They're more like at 25%, the highest rate that was suffered during the Depression of the 1930s. So I'm going on record as saying that. That is my best estimate, and I'm going to leave you with that and take some time now to look at your comments, but I am going to give you the ending message that due to the Trump administration and its absolutely horrible, horrible handling of this crisis, it looks like we may very well be the world leader in both unemployment rate and fatalities from this virus. And meanwhile, while we're accelerating to those kinds of outcomes, the administration is acting idiotically and barbarically, okay, and murderously. And the Congress is sitting there twiddling its thumbs and doing nothing to help people. We need a Medicare for All bill, at least for the duration of the crisis. We need it right now, without any further delay. We need income support for people all across the country. We need job support for people all across the country, where most of those jobs can be jobs at home. We need a federal job guarantee. We need payroll support for those who want to keep their businesses open. And we need to get that money to people fast, and our present systems are not doing that. So we have to install the system that's been proposed by Jayapal and also Tlaib in the Automatic Boost to Communities Act. We need to have debit cards loaded with a digital currency that we can distribute to people and to businesses to create the necessary economic supports to keep our economy going while we keep our people surviving. And we cannot brook any excuses for not acting in the way people in our government should be acting. And if Donald Trump on his side continues to resist, then we need Nancy Pelosi to impeach him one more time. And he needs to be impeached on this basis for needlessly killing so many Americans with his policies. That is surely a high crime and misdemeanor. He needs to be impeached for that. And the Republicans need to be dared to vote against such an impeachment in the middle of these accelerating fatality rates. That's what has to happen. I'll now consider your comments. So thank you for staying. Thank you for sharing. I know this was a long one. I think it was a very good one. I know that some of you were not able to share tonight. I know that's Facebook. We face repression from Facebook. We're probably going to face some more for this particular video. That's all right. Don't worry about it. We can share later. We can share the video later. It's going to be up on YouTube. It's going to be up on Facebook. If we want to place it other places, we can load it up. Okay, other places too. It can be spread. There's time to share. Don't worry about it. Okay? Steve has shared the group. Stephanie says, hey, my loves. Bonnie says, hi, everyone. Stephanie says, I can't share. I'm sorry to hear it, Stephanie. And you can call Bonnie Bonnie. Makes her feel old. It makes her feel old if you call her Miss Bonnie. And Dolores says, I posted on Twitter and MeWe. Thank you, Dolores. Steve says, share, share, share. And Stephanie says, hey, folks, Facebook is not letting me share. If I could get as many viewers as possible to share to your groups, that would be so helpful tonight. Rick says, evening, everyone. Steve says, Facebook only lets me share to about 6 groups. Deborah Wilson says, just got here. Hi, Deborah. Well, that was only 12 minutes past the time I started. That's not bad. Steve says, please share this out. Steve says, anything will help. Kane is appreciated. Sorry, Stephanie said that. She said it to Steve Wolfbrandt. Kay says, already shared. Nikki King says, hi, Joe and everyone. Hi, Nikki. Kay says, we also have states' rights, and that isn't helpful for these nationwide things. Oh, I have to do an experiment. I'm sorry. I have to do a little bit of an experiment. Okay, I just want to check on and see if this works the way it's supposed to work. It'll only take me a second. I'll be right back to reading your comments. Okay, let's see how that works. So where is it? That's supposed to go. Oh, there it is. So there it is. A gentle reminder. Okay, enough of the reminder. So let me go back now and read your comments. If I can find them. Here we go. So Kay says, we also have states' rights, and that isn't helpful for these nationwide things. Rick says they have the same amount of disinformation as us, apparently. Rick says, debunking pandemic nonsense. And there's a Google Doc that he's circulating here. Thank you, Rick. Steve says, give us liberty or give us death. Okay, here's death. You happy now? And Kay says, Steve, the GOP might be killing off their own voters. Nikki says, at first I thought it was odd, okay, that the GOP wanted to kill their own voters. But then I remembered how the DNC and Biden insisted on Wisconsin voting along, even though our Dem governor wanted to postpone it. I know, wasn't that awful? Wasn't that awful? And Illinois also. They insisted on the primary, okay, in Illinois. It was dangerous there too. And Washington. It wasn't safe in Washington. They were in the middle of the pandemic in Washington. Kay says, good point, Nikki. Corporate politicians are all alike. And Janice Thomason says, watching from Kentucky. Hi, Janice. Welcome to you. Steve Wolfbrand says, here in California, we're doing pretty good. People in Los Angeles don't like each other very much. That's turned out to be a good thing. We stay in our cars and hate each other. Hey, my daughter Devora really likes it in Los Angeles. And she likes people in Los Angeles, too. And she's enjoying herself, even, of course, she has to stay in the house now. Kay says, I think this virus is really why Bernie suspended his campaign. Rallies are no longer safe. I'm sure this was a big factor. He didn't want to feel that he was putting people in danger by having rallies. And he felt that without the rallies and without the canvassing, he didn't really have much chance. Alec says Rick is leading a right-wing campaign to reopen the economy despite COVID-19. Alec is attempting to use the national crisis to leverage some movement on its pro-corporate policy agenda, and he links to an article in Common Dreams. Good article on that subject. Kay says, let them kill off their own blind supporters. Sad, but seems like they're doing just that. Rick. And Nikki King says, I had a maybe not so crazy thought a few days ago that it would not surprise me to find the whole thing was done deliberately to stop both Bernie and Trump. Well, it seems to be stopping Bernie, but whether it's stopping Trump, okay, is another matter. Though it's hard to imagine Trump actually winning if the truth about what he's done with the coronavirus takes hold. And I don't see why it would not take hold. I mean, it's obvious. It's plain as the nose on your face when you compare our figures with the figures from other nations. It's plain that he did not stop the spread of the virus. Worth a damn. Kay says, nothing would surprise me anymore, Nikki. Rick says, please join me and our awesome partners at the climate mobilization for a webinar this Wednesday, May 13th at 8 p.m. EST. Quote, COVID-19, the climate emergency, and the battle for our future. 0 Hour founder Jamie Margolin and other youth climate leaders will speak on the relationship between the coronavirus and the climate emergency, and you can learn how to build power for a climate emergency response in your community. Click here to sign up and please share. That seems very, very worthwhile, folks. Kay says, Nikki, I'm all done holding my nose to vote for the lesser of two evils. I did that with Clinton, and that didn't work out so well, did it? No, it didn't work out so well. But I will say this about Clinton, okay, and the coronavirus, and I know exactly where you're coming from, Kay. Okay, and that is Hillary Clinton, as execrable as she is, and as much as I cannot stand her, and as much as she would have resisted Medicare for All as she took over, there is no way she would have dismantled Obama's pandemic response directorate. There is no way she would have allowed a threat of this kind to go unmet. She is rational enough and smart enough to have moved heaven and earth to stop this virus in its tracks, because the Clintons are smart enough to recognize an electoral threat to their positions. They've always been smart enough, okay, to recognize that when they were in office. Now, Hillary didn't do a very good job when she was running for office, but if she had been in office, she would instantly have recognized that a pandemic that could have an impact on the economy was a major threat to her reelection hopes, and she would have moved vigorously to handle the pandemic. And there's no way that we would have had the fatalities that we have thus far had. What's true is true, and you have to recognize that while she would have had a very bad administration with an economy that would not have been good for us, that still we would not have suffered the nearly 80,000 deaths that we have now suffered from this, and we would not be in position to get into the hundreds of thousands over the next couple of months if she had been the President of the United States. Now, I'm not saying that we progressives are to blame for her not being the President of the United States. I do not believe that. I believe she's not the President of the United States because she refused to run on a Medicare for All ticket. She refused to run against the TPP from the get-go, and she refused to run on an expansive type of economic agenda, which included something like a Green New Deal. If she had run on those three things, she would have won from Donald Trump going away. But she had to give people the impression that she cared about them. And the reason why she lost is she kept saying no to people instead of saying yes to people. That's why she lost. And I don't think it was our fault. I don't think it was because we didn't to a person vote for her after they cheated Bernie out of the nomination. I think it was because of her incompetent campaign people and her incompetent self when it comes to campaigning. I don't think she would have been incompetent as a president facing the coronavirus, however. I don't think that for a moment. So Steve says, Norway is probably the best country on earth. He says, I think that my Viking blood is 100%, but that's too cold for me. If your Viking blood is 100%, how could it be too cold for you, Steve? That's what I want to know. And he says, maybe Mexico when this is over. Oh, you think the Vikings all want to go to Mexico? Kay says, Steve, too bad. We can't all move to a state in this country and turn it into a progressive country of our own. I've often thought that California and Oregon and Washington should perhaps secede and form another country. It would be plenty large enough to be a country on its own. Those three states put together, they've got to have close to 50 million people. And that's a sizable country. And they probably easily get joined quickly, okay, by Arizona and maybe by Idaho and Manhattan and also Montana and also Nevada, as red state as some of those places are. It would be hard to avoid the kind of economic pull that the first three states would have. So anyway, I wonder about the possibility of that. Lana says, wow, what a story. And Matt says, lesser of two evils voting just gets you a far greater evil down the road. Over the decades, such voting has moved the duopoly further to the right. I quite agree, Matt. And Steve says, good night. I'm sleepy. I love you all. You got sleepy at 10 p.m., Steve? Steve, how old are you? How old are you? Of course, I'm never sleepy by 10 p.m. because often in the morning I don't get up until 10 p.m. And Kay said, love you back, Steve. And Matt said, yes, the current administration did utterly fail during this pandemic. But this is not a partisan failure. It has been a total failure, Kay, of our entire government. But the administration's role in it has been a failure of the administration. Okay, and a failure of the Republican Party to press the administration, okay, to do anything about it. The constant support that the Republicans in the Senate have given to Donald Trump has been a scandal. It's just been a scandal. Okay, now I agree in the economic response. That is a bipartisan failure in Congress. That certainly is quite true. But even there, that bipartisan failure was led by Mitch McConnell and is still being led by him. Now, when the House Democrats are finally ready to try to do something decent for the population, the Senate Republicans, okay, and Mitch McConnell are doing everything they can to block something from being done. They are causing the unemployment pandemic we have now here in the U.S. Matt says we need all countries to espouse the values enshrined in the preamble to the WHO Constitution, which outlines a comprehensive declaration of health as a human right. We certainly do. And Lana says, how are you, Janice Thomason? And Kay says, I'm so sick of this society, I almost would rather be dead instead of dealing with the mess we're in now. Kay says, I watched that on Democracy Now! And Matt says, 130,000 die each year because of poverty. We do not have the value that each life is sacred. We rank order the value of life. This is immoral. Matt, it surely is, okay, immoral. And this is particularly clear in the health insurance area, where for years we've allowed thousands upon thousands of people 30,000, 35,000, 45,000. Now it's approaching 50 to 55,000 who would be likely to die simply through lack of health insurance. Simply through lack of health insurance. This has been a scandal for years. During the Obama administration, by my estimates, 356,000 people died due to lack of health insurance. During the time of the implementation of Obamacare from 2010 through 2016, 356,000 people. Of course, that has continued with even greater numbers per year during the Trump administration. Okay, so Nikki King says we'll hit 150K by the end of June. I believe it's going to be before that. She says, I mean the end of May. I think maybe. Kay says, Matthew, people have not cared for the poor or the old or the disabled in this country since the 80s. At least it has gotten worse and worse as privatization has expanded nationwide. I've seen it happen my whole adult life, but just about. Yes, exactly, Kay. Ever since Reagan told the country that we didn't need to care about anyone else, people needed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's the ideology of Ayn Rand spreading throughout the country, being spread by Republicans like Alan Greenspan and Paul Ryan, and to some degree by Reagan. Yes. And Kay says, Matthew, I've been fighting since the late 60s, old and damn tired of the fight. Deborah Wilson says, remember Trump's first task force briefing? He was bragging that his CEO pals at CVS and Walgreens would soften the blow. They were there with paper towels, laugh out loud. Just kidding about the last part. And Matt says, Trump's rhetorical strategy was to argue the subjunctive. If he hadn't closed down when he did, then millions would have died. A few 100,000 deaths is comparatively small. Silly. It gets very, very silly when you compare what's happening in this country to what is happening in some of the other countries we've covered here tonight. And Matt says, I hear you, but we want you alive. Where there's life, there's hope. Kay says, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. Kay says, who knows how long this virus will last? I've heard that people can be infected more than once. SMH. We've all heard that, but we don't know that for sure. And Kay says, I'm so old my mother used to take me to measles, chickenpox, and mumps parties in the 50s so I would get it over the summer and not have to miss school. Oh, laugh out loud. Lana says, none of us will be able to avoid coming into contact with the virus forever. For me, when I do, I hope there will be some decent medicine they have, even if it's not a vaccine, and to keep myself as healthy as possible with a boosted immune system to combat it. Yeah, we've been very careful, Lana, very careful. And Matthew says, oh my God, Kay, I vaguely recall when I got the chicken pox. Seems like forever ago. I recall when I got it too, and believe me, it was forever ago. I think I'm a lot older than you, Matt. I can remember when I was 5 or 6 getting it. I scratched a lot. Kay says, well, back in the 50s, those parties were the only way to get immune to those diseases. Mark says that has since been debunked. What has been debunked, Mark? I lived through it. And Matt says, if we can just get a vaccine, some good therapeutic drugs that actually prevent, or minimize death, and better public health practices, it will be better. Yes. We need to get some of the legislation that Sanders and Jayapal, Tlaib, even Kamala Harris, and Ed Markey are putting on the table right now, as we speak. Yes, but even Kamala Harris is getting into the act. I think even Joe Kennedy is starting to get into the act. Okay, and Lana says, I had chickenpox as an infant. Then my son gave it to me again when I was 25. Jesus. I was down for 2 weeks, completely took the wind out of my sails. Mark says, COVID-19 did come back in those patients. The tests were false positives due to low-quality testing. Kay says, never got any of those diseases again. Lana says, makes me recall when my kids were young. There were months when it seemed like my wife and I were sick all the time from everything the kids brought home. Okay, Nikki says, I don't think a vaccine is even possible for several reasons. I bet there are actually three mutations already. A doctor yesterday was talking about autopsies, and he said it has the ability to mimic other diseases. They find it all over the body, and it hides in some cells. That makes me think it could hide and lay in wait and appear as some unexpected illness crops up that it can take advantage of. Ay, ay, ay. God, I hope that's not true. I think that's still to be established, and I'm not going to panic until there's definite news about something like that. Kay says, okay, Mark, I believe that. My youngest daughter in Florida got tested and came back negative, but a week later was in the hospital with near-stroke conditions. I think she had it too, and the test was wrong. She's only 35. Oh, that's amazing. And Nikki says, is she okay? And Matt says, that almost makes the coronavirus seem like a herpes virus that can lie in wait and become reactivated. And Nikki says something like that for sure. Kay says, seems to be for now. She went back to work in the parking garage she works at there. She trusts her doctors, so haven't pointed the discrepancies to her. But Florida ranks 48th in the country for good health care now. Sick care at its finest there. Oh, yes. And no preventive care, probably. Kay says, I remember when Ohio was among the best in the world, and we're now ranked 38th, Kay, in the country. Yeah, that's because there have been a lot of Republicans in Ohio for a long time. Kay says, for profit, sick care is killing us all. I used to have a chat friend who worked for the NHS in the UK, and she explained to me that if the country has a financial interest in keeping people well, they will do that. We did the opposite in this country. Yes, we did. Harry Truman failed to pass it, and Lyndon Johnson also failed to pass it. Jack Kennedy failed to pass it. Nikki King says, nice joke. And Lana Dell says, the banner is good. You should leave it up for the whole time, including the YouTube page name. I don't think I want to leave it up for the whole time because it's taking too much of the screen up. So I don't think that I want to leave it up the whole time. I think I'll show it a few times, but I think I'll do that, but I don't think that, okay, I'm going to leave it up for the whole show. Kay says, I understand that about Hillary, Joe. That wasn't the point. Yes, I know it wasn't Kay, but I thought it was important to make that point. Okay, you know, all honesty, that we would actually have had better outcomes on this matter if Hillary had been the president, okay, than Trump. Now, I'm not saying anything about the possibility of war. We might have had a worse time with wars, okay, if Hillary had been the president. Kay says corporate Dems suck. They certainly do. And Stephanie said, I'm back with some charge, finally. And she said, Facebook still isn't letting me share. Have you checked to see if you're in Facebook jail, Stephanie? You should be able to learn that. You go to your settings and you look and see, you scroll down and you see if you have a message. And Sam is sending me a message, okay, on Messenger. And he says, when would you be available to chat on the phone at some point? I can be available sometime tomorrow. So I don't know why. He sent me that by private message, so I shouldn't be taking up all your times with that. And I don't even know if he's watching now. Anyway, so tomorrow I am off. Okay, I've gone through all your comments now, and Bonnie is waving at me to say so long for the night. So I think I will do that. But one more time, I will show my banner. Hi, please share, like, and subscribe. And please remember my Patreon is at patreon.com, Joe_Firestone. So thank you very much for coming once again. And on that note, I will say a merry good night. And I will see you again on Monday night during the 9 o'clock hour. And on Tuesday night, I'm having a conversation with Arakel Bloss, a noted activist, okay, an organizer. And we're going to talk about the coronavirus again. She's been doing a lot of recent work on the coronavirus, and I'm sure it'll be fascinating to talk to Arakel on Tuesday night. So I'm starting to promote that actually right now. Anyway, have a very good day tomorrow and a very good day on Monday until I see you at 9. Thanks for coming.